Speaking on their own, individual farmers were lone voice, crying in the wilderness of the Canadian prairies and rarely heard by politicians in Ottawa and provincial capitals. But when all farmers came together to speak with a single voice, governments had to listen. Hi, and welcome to episode 6 of season 1 of Social Democrats of the North, presented by the Broadbent Institute's Perspectives Journal podcast series. I'm your host, Dave McGrane, a professor of political science at St. Thomas More College and the University of Saskatchewan, and a member of the Perspectives Journal Editorial Committee. From Confederation to the Quiet Revolution, Social Democrats of the North takes you on a journey through history to discover the lives and ideas of the leaders who have shaped Canadian social democracy. I hope that by listening to my podcast, you will become more aware of the contribution of social democracy to the history of Canada and even get some tips for your own political activism. In the last episode, I looked at J.S. Wordsworth and how the social gospel was such an important element of the history of Canadian social democracy in the 20th century. In this episode, we are going to shift gears a bit and look at another crucially important part of Canadian social democracy in the early 1900s, radical prairie farmers. Today, we often think of farmers and people who live in rural areas as being quite conservative. But that wasn't always the case in the early 1900s on the Canadian prairies. In fact, the Canadian prairies were a hotbed of social democratic protest against the established political and economic order of the early 1900s. And one of the most famous prairie socialists of this time period was undoubtedly Edward Alexander Partridge, better known as E.A. Partridge. Partridge was born on a farm near Barrie, Ontario in 1861. His early life was not particularly easy. He was one of 14 children born to a family living on a struggling farm. On top of this, his mother died when he was a baby, and he was sent to live with his grandparents. Despite their poverty, his grandparents eventually scraped up enough money so that he could obtain a teacher's certificate, and he began teaching at a school in Barrie. But Partridge was a restless type of person who was only really content when he was part of building something larger than himself. In the early 1880s, Partridge was feeling like the life of a teacher in a one-room school was not exciting enough for him. Then he heard that the federal government had opened up the Canadian prairies to what was called homesteading. At the time, the federal government was in the process of what historian James Daschuk calls clearing the plains. That is, the government was displacing Indigenous peoples from their traditional lands and confining them to small reservations that were controlled by government bureaucrats called Indian agents. Once the Indigenous peoples were removed from their lands, the federal government then offered those lands to white settlers, who they called homesteaders, free of charge. In exchange for the free land, the homesteader had to agree to spend a specific number of years on their homestead to turn the uncultivated land into the farms that continue to dot the Canadian prairie landscape to this day. In fact, on the prairies, when someone talks about their home quarter, they are referring to the quarter section of land that is the basis of the original homestead claim of their farming operations. For an ambitious and restless young man who is eager to work with others to build up great things, homesteading sounded like a great opportunity to Partridge. So, at the age of 22, Partridge jumped at the chance to head out to Western Canada with his brother Harry to be part of the first wave of homesteaders. Brimming with optimism and ready to conquer the world, Partridge arrived in Sultana in 1883. It was located in what was then called the Northwest Territories, but what is now called Saskatchewan. He was duly allotted one quarter section of land to homestead. However, homesteading was a lot harder than Partridge anticipated. While the farmland was free, Partridge did not have the money to purchase the seed and machinery necessary to farm his homestead. The excitement that Partridge had felt as he traveled out west quickly turned to feelings of hopelessness and despair upon his arrival. He had believed the federal government's promises about the prosperity of the Prairie West, but now he was stuck out on the cold-balled prairie, feeling like a victim of forces that were well outside of his control. Partridge was forced to return to teaching to try to save up the necessary money to buy the equipment and seed needed to start farming. He also made money when he signed up in 1885 to be a soldier in the Yorkton Active Militia of Canada. Along with his fellow soldiers, Partridge helped put down the Northwest Rebellion, which is often seen by historians as part of the resistance of Métis and First Nations peoples to the unfair theft of their land that was taking place during the first wave of homesteading. It should be noted that Partridge was a private in the federal government's army that put down Louis Riel and his rebels during the Northwest Rebellion. So Partridge ended up playing a small role in the armed conflict that was caused when the federal government forcibly displaced the original indigenous inhabitants of the prairies and replaced them with white settlers. Partridge's participation in the Northwest Rebellion on the side of the white settlers definitely reflects his strong opinions that homesteaders were entitled to the land given to them by the federal government. And it evidently signals his approval of the coercive removal of indigenous peoples from their traditional lands. By 1887, Partridge had saved up enough money to begin farming his homestead, and he married a young woman, Mary Stevens, who he had met during his travels as a teacher. The newlywed couple happily started off their life together by building an impressive 2-story brick house and a large barn on an area that came to be known as the Bluffs. Despite the beauty of the prairie landscape all around them, life was tough for the Partridges. Over the next decade, they experienced firsthand the hardship and isolation of farming on the prairies and trying to produce a crop that could provide them with a decent living. Their land was rocky, and it needed to be painstakingly cleared using horses and rudimentary machinery before a crop could even be planted. Then, once the land was cleared, the seeds that were available were not well adapted to the prairie climate. Just the perfect amount of rain, some but not too much, was needed to grow a good crop. Even when the Partridges could produce an adequate crop, the railway companies and the grain handling companies from eastern Canada controlled the transportation of that crop to Ontario where it could be sold. The owners of these big companies used their monopoly on grain transportation to charge sky-high prices to farmers to ship their grain eastward, resulting in poverty for prairie farmers even when they did succeed in growing a good crop. To Partridge, it didn't seem to matter how hard he worked. Some force outside of his control would always intervene to make it tough for his family to make ends meet. The anger towards railways and grain companies reached a fever pitch in the fall of 1901. In 1901, farmers initially rejoiced because they had hauled in a huge crop. However, eastern grain companies and railway companies refused to allocate enough rail cars to transport this record-breaking wheat harvest to port to be sold. The result was that much of the crop rotted in bins as it waited to be shipped out east. Along with many other grain farmers, Partridge was heartbroken to see the grain that his family had worked so hard to grow spoil before his eyes, just as he was about to face another harsh prairie winter. By this time, Partridge was sick and tired of being the victim of so many forces that he could not control. He decided to do something about it. He decided to cooperate with his fellow farmers to build up a set of institutions that could give them more control over their livelihoods. He did this in 3 ways. First, he got a group of farmers together at a meeting in Indian Head, Saskatchewan to discuss the idea of creating a farmers' organization that could lobby governments to improve the situation of prairie farming families. The result was the establishment of the Territorial Grain Growers Association in 1902, which was renamed the Saskatchewan Grain Grower Association when Saskatchewan became a province in 1905. The importance of the Saskatchewan Grain Grower Association was that it triggered the creation of the Alberta Grain Grower Association and the Manitoba Grain Grower Association. Together, these 3 organizations gave farmers a collective voice with which to lobby provincial and federal governments. Speaking on their own, individual farmers were lone voice, crying in the wilderness of the Canadian prairies and rarely heard by politicians in Ottawa and provincial capitals. But when all farmers came together to speak with a single voice, governments had to listen. Second, to cooperate effectively with each other, prairie farmers had to have a means to communicate with each other. So Partridge collaborated with other farmers to establish a magazine called the Grain Growers Guide. The Grain Growers Guide was a huge success, and it was soon found on almost every farm across the prairies. Its articles challenged the mainstream newspapers of the time period. They explained to farmers that their financial difficulties were the result of an unfair economic system that exploited them and gave huge profits to the owners of banks, railways, and grain elevators who lived in Toronto and Montreal. The guide, as it was often called, also provided an important forum for farmers to debate with each other about the changes that need to take place in Canadian politics and the Canadian economy to solve the problems of Western Canada. Third, Partridge was sent by the Saskatchewan Grain Growers Association in 1905 to observe the workings of the Winnipeg Grain Exchange that was responsible for selling all of the grain produced on the prairies. He was treated horribly by the traders at the exchange as some country hick. They made jokes at his expense, called him a hayseed, and basically told him to go back to from where he came. Partridge was insulted, but he was still happy that he went. His trip allowed him to figure out that the whole grain handling and grain marketing system was rigged to work against farmers and work only in favor of big businessmen. The farmers were like puppets, and the big businessmen were pulling the strings. Partridge reported back to the farmers in Saskatchewan that the elevator companies, millers, and exporters colluded to set grain prices so that they were at their lowest during fall harvest period, exactly the time when farmers had to sell their grain to obtain cash to pay their debts. Then, these big businessmen made future contracts with the British buyers for delivery of that grain at far higher prices. The big difference between the price that the farmers sold the grain on the exchange and the price that the British buyers paid for the grain went straight into the pockets of these big businessmen. Partridge came up with a solution to bypass these middlemen entirely. Along with other farmers across the prairies, he helped create the Grain Growers Grain Company that would sell grain directly to British grain buyers, thereby ensuring higher prices for prairie farmers. This cooperative approach to selling grain angered the big businessmen who controlled the Winnipeg Grain Exchange. A legal battle ensued where these businessmen tried to shut down Partridge's company. While their efforts were not completely successful, these businessmen did force the farmer-owned cooperative to make some changes to its structure that made it less effective and less competitive. I want to pause here to point out that what Partridge is doing in the decade from 1900 to 1910 is mixing social democracy with what is now called Western Canadian alienation. I would define Western alienation as the feeling that Canadian politics and the Canadian economy are structured in a way that is unfair to Western Canada. Western alienation is now usually thought of as something that comes out of conservative politics. But my exploration of the life and ideas of Partridge shows that this is not how Western alienation got started. Partridge's diagnosis of the problems facing prairie farmers was clearly social democratic. Partridge's left-wing version of Western alienation identifies the concentration of Canadian wealth within a small group of companies owned by businessmen in Toronto and Ontario as the reason that prairie farmers were facing so much financial hardship. These big businessmen from the East impoverished prairie farmers through charging excessive freight rates for transporting grain and insisting on the implementation of large tariffs on American-made goods that forced prairie farmers to buy expensive goods made in central Canada. Further, big businessmen from Eastern Canada owned all of the banks operating in Western Canada. These banks routinely charged ridiculously high rates for loans to farmers looking to build a new house or to buy the land and the machinery necessary to expand their agricultural operations. Not only was Partridge's explanation of the problems facing prairie farmers explicitly social democratic, so was his solution. He came up with the very social democratic Partridge Plan. The plan outlined how economic power should be taken away from large Eastern Canadian private businesses by establishing government-owned companies that would provide banking, insurance, and grain transportation at fair and reasonable prices. At the same time, The plan laid out how cooperatives that are owned and controlled by farmers themselves could sell grain and provide storage for grain as it awaits to go to the market. The final part of the Partridge plan called for high taxes on the owners of large Eastern Canadian businesses to pay for government-funded healthcare, pensions, and education in Western Canada. My whole point is that Western alienation, as it was originally conceived by Partridge, was actually a social democratic project. It's not until later in Canadian history that Western alienation takes on a more conservative tone. By 1910, Partridge was very well known as a farm leader across the Canadian prairies. In fact, he was a major thorn in the side of Eastern Canadian elites who controlled the Western Canadian economy. So much that they began to angrily refer to him as that man Partridge. It's easy to see why big businessmen from the East disliked Partridge so much. Partridge had succeeded in building up a set of institutions that would give farmers at least some control of their livelihoods, whether that control be through marketing their own grain or having strong organizations that would make governments take the concerns of farmers seriously. Partridge was finding ways for prairie farmers to control their own destiny. From 1910 to 1915, Partridge's activity becomes more explicitly political. He led a delegation of approximately 800 prairie farmers on a trek to Ottawa, where they took part in what was referred to as the Siege of Ottawa. The farmers essentially forced themselves into the House of Commons when it was in session. For over 4 hours, the MPs and ministers had to listen to several speakers, including Partridge, list off all of the grievances of prairie farmers. However, from the viewpoint of Partridge, neither the federal Liberal government nor the Conservative opposition in Ottawa did much to improve the lives of farmers following the Siege of Ottawa. So Partridge started to advocate for farmers to set their own political party. He argued that farmers could only control their own destiny if they had representatives accountable to them in both Ottawa and the provincial capitals of the prairies. The more conservative and moderate elements in the Grain Growers Association were, however, opposed to Partridge's ideas and wanted to continue for farmer groups to be only lobby groups and not enter into electoral politics. Undeterred, Partridge founded the No Party League of Western Canada in 1913 to run farmer candidates against Liberal and Conservative politicians across the prairies. Well, the No Farm League was not very successful. It laid the groundwork for the farmer parties of the 1920s, some of whom, like the United Farmers of Alberta, even formed provincial governments. In the time period from 1915 to 1920, Partridge's political influence across the prairies starts to wane, and he faced a number of personal tragedies. He was an active farmer throughout his life, and he almost had his leg completely severed off in a farming accident when one of his horses got spooked as he was trying to remove a tangled lump of grain from his combine. After the accident, Partridge's health was poor, and he had to go through a number of surgeries that left him in bed for long periods of time. Then his daughter drowned while swimming, and both of his sons were killed during fighting overseas in World War I. Partridge became gradually less active in the farmers' movement and moved into retirement in the early 1920s. In retirement, he wrote a fascinating book called A War on Poverty. It is the blueprint for an utopian country that he calls Kozamola. Partridge argues that Kozamola would be an independent country comprising of Canada's four most western provinces. He claimed that it could be an example of a perfect social democratic society because it would not be influenced by the big business owners located in Toronto and Montreal. He even outlines how this new country would set a high standard of cooperation because everybody would live in perfect harmony and share all that they had with each other. In the book, he writes the following passage: "My strong desire is that the people of Western Canada will peacefully achieve full political autonomy, and that, enjoying self-determination as the single political unit, will exercise it to establish a cooperative commonwealth." The book was read by many farmers on the prairies, and the term cooperative commonwealth ends up being the name of the political party that was the forerunner to the NDP, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, or the CCF. However, I should note that no one took his ideas about Western separation all that seriously, and this was indicative of his waning political influence in the 1920s. After his wife died of a heart attack in 1926, Partridge moved to live with his daughter in Victoria, BC. He would never see the Canadian prairies and their farming communities again. By this time, he was 64 years old and in very poor health with arthritis and lingering complications from his amputated leg. In 1931, he commits suicide by inhaling gas in his apartment. However, he never left a suicide note, so it's impossible to know why he decided to take his own life. Partridge's most important contribution to Canadian history is that he mixed ideas of social democracy and Western alienation. This mixture of Western alienation and social democracy helped to build the farmer protest movement that spread across the prairies in the early 1900s. This protest movement had wide-ranging effects on Canadian politics in the 1920s and 1930s. For instance, it forced the federal government to more decisively intervene in the Canadian economy. It also led to the creation of new farmers' parties that would challenge liberal and conservative dominance of Canadian politics. Without the farmer protest movement, it is questionable as to whether Canada would have developed the tradition of activist government that differentiates it from the United States to this day. I think that the lesson we can take from Partridge's life is that it's perfectly natural to feel hopeless and feel like we are victims of forces beyond our control. In fact, we probably all are. But we can't let these feelings make us think that we are helpless and powerless. We do have the ability to become politically involved and build up organizations that can make changes in our society. Indeed, the organizations that we build up today will outlive us and make valuable contributions to the cause of social democracy tomorrow. In this sense, our political involvement will always be useful. And if we cooperate with each other, will give us the power to shape the society in which we live. I'm Dave McGrane, and thanks for joining me on Social Democrats of the North, a Perspectives Journal podcast series produced by the Broadbent Institute. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe or leave a review on the Perspectives Journal podcast on all major podcast platforms and share it with someone you know who loves Canadian political history. And subscribe to Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in any major newspaper. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca. Next time, we will explore the life and ideas of Alberta's first Social Democratic MP, who never got discouraged no matter what obstacles he faced. Until then, keep questioning the status quo and stay social democratic.